Under two blazing suns, Lyra crouched low, her sharp eyes scanning the endless expanse of golden sand. The wind carried whispers of dust and decay, painting a picture of desolation that stretched as far as she could see. This was her world now, a broken place where ruins rose like fractured bones from the earth. She adjusted the straps of her scavenger's pack, feeling the weight of survival press against her shoulders. Every day was a battle to find enough food and water to stay alive. But today felt different. In the distance, something glinted beneath the harsh light of the twin suns. It wasn't natural. Nothing shiny survived out here for long without being swallowed by the sands. Curiosity tugged at her, stronger than caution. Clutching her plasma blade tightly, she moved closer, each step careful and deliberate. As she approached, the object became clearer, a ship half buried in the dunes. Its sleek surface gleamed despite layers of grit, and strange symbols etched into its side hinted at origins far beyond her planet. Lyra hesitated, her heart pounding. Ships like this belonged to humans, or so the story said. Humans were dangerous. They had come once before, long ago, when her people thrived. Now only legends remained of their arrival, tales passed down through generations of how they took what they wanted and left destruction behind. Still, the pull of discovery was too strong to ignore. As she circled the craft, a sudden hiss startled her. A hatch slid open with a mechanical groan, revealing darkness within. Lyra froze, gripping her blade tighter. Then, slowly, a figure emerged. Tall and clad in a suit that shimmered faintly, the stranger stepped into the sunlight. Their face was hidden behind a reflective mask, making it impossible to read their expression. For a moment, neither moved. The air seemed heavy with unspoken questions. "Stay back," the figure said finally, raising one gloved hand. Their voice was deep but carried an odd familiarity, like the echo of a song heard in childhood. Lyra frowned, lowering her blade slightly but not letting her guard down completely. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone sharper than she intended. "This is my land." The masked figure tilted their head, as if considering her words. Then, slowly, deliberately, they reached up and removed their helmet. Lyra gasped. Beneath the mask was a face she thought she'd never see again, a face that looked eerily similar to hers, yet older, marked by years of hardship. His features were human, but there was something alien about them too, something that stirred memories buried deep within her mind. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice trembling. "It's me, Kale." Her breath caught in her throat. Kale. That name. It couldn't be real. He was supposed to be gone, taken away during the Great Exodus, a tragic event she barely remembered except in fragments of nightmares. Yet here he stood, alive and breathing, staring at her with eyes full of guilt and longing. For a moment, anger surged inside her. How dare he return after all these years? But then she saw the pain in his gaze, the weight of secrets pressing down on him. Whatever brought him back, it wasn't simple, and somehow, she knew, he needed her help. The wind picked up again, swirling around them like a restless spirit. Lyra tightened her grip on her blade, torn between fear, curiosity, and the flicker of recognition stirring in her chest. Who was this man who claimed to know her? And why did his presence feel like both a blessing and a curse? This version keeps the tone engaging and accessible while building tension and intrigue. Let me know if you'd like adjustments or further elaboration. The name hung in the air like a ghost from another time. Kale. Lyra repeated it silently to herself, her mind racing as she tried to piece together fragments of memories buried beneath years of survival and loss. She stared at him, her blade still raised defensively, but her resolve faltered with every passing second. The man before her looked nothing like the Kale she remembered, or thought she remembered. His face was weathered, marked by lines that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried. Yet there was no mistaking the shape of his eyes or the curve of his jaw. It was him. "You're lying," Lyra said sharply, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Kale is gone. He disappeared during the Exodus. You can't just show up here after all these years and expect me to believe you." Cale lowered his hand slowly, his expression softening into something akin to sorrow. "I know how this looks," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "But I'm not lying, Lyra. I've come back. For answers." "Answers?" Her grip on the blade tightened again. "What kind of answers could possibly bring you here, and why now?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the half-buried ship behind him. For a moment, Lyra thought he might refuse to answer. But then he sighed deeply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Do you remember the stories about the humans, the ones who came to our world centuries ago? They didn't just leave, Lyra. They took us, took our people, experimented on them, used them." Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. Those stories were more than familiar. They haunted her dreams. Tales of abduction, experimentation, and betrayal had been passed down through generations. They were warnings whispered around campfires, reminders of what humanity was capable of. But hearing Cale speak them aloud made them feel heavier somehow, as if he knew things she didn't. "I escaped," Cale continued, his gaze locking onto hers. "Years ago. But I wasn't the only one taken, Lyra. Do you understand? Your parents, your family, they weren't lost. They were taken." The words struck her like a physical blow. Her knees wobbled slightly, and she forced herself to take a step back, needing space to breathe. Memories flickered in her mind. Images of her mother's laughter, her father's strong arms lifting her high into the air. She had always believed they died in the Exodus, victims of chaos and violence. To think otherwise, to imagine they suffered far worse. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You don't get to tell me this. Not now. Not after everything." "I'm sorry," Cale said quietly, his voice breaking. "I wanted to protect you. That's why I left, to find out the truth. To make sure no one else would have to live like we did. Like you've had to." His words stirred something deep within her, a mix of anger and longing she couldn't quite untangle. Part of her wanted to lash out, to scream at him for abandoning her when she needed him most. Another part, a smaller, quieter part, wanted to believe him. If even half of what he said was true, then their fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about reclaiming what had been stolen. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Cale stepped closer, his movements cautious but determined. "Help me uncover the truth. Together, we can expose what happened to our people. We can make sure no one forgets." For a long moment, Lyra simply stared at him, weighing his words against the pain and distrust simmering inside her. Finally, she nodded once, lowering her blade. "Fine," she said. "But if you betray me again, Cale, I won't hesitate." As they stood there under the twin suns, two figures bound by shared history and fractured trust, the wind carried whispers of storms yet to come. Whatever path lay ahead, Lyra knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Lyra led Cale through winding canyons carved by ancient rivers, their jagged walls casting long shadows as the twin suns dipped lower in the sky. The journey to her tribe's sanctuary was a silent one, each step heavy with unspoken questions and lingering doubts. She didn't trust him, not fully, but something about his presence felt undeniable. It wasn't just the resemblance or the shared memories. It was the way he carried himself, like someone burdened by secrets too dangerous to keep alone. The entrance to the sanctuary was hidden behind a cascade of glowing vines that shimmered faintly in the fading light. Lyra paused, glancing back at Cale before pushing the vines aside. "Stay quiet," she warned under her breath. "They won't take kindly to strangers." Inside, the cavern opened into a vast chamber illuminated by bioluminescent crystals embedded in the walls. The soft glow revealed clusters of makeshift shelters, where members of her tribe went about their evening routines. Children played with scraps of salvaged tech, while elders sat huddled around small fires, sharing stories passed down through generations. The air smelled of roasted tubers and damp earth, a comforting scent Lyra had almost forgotten during her time scavenging outside. As they approached the center of the chamber, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned toward them, some curious, others wary. An elder woman named Mira stepped forward, her silver hair tied back in intricate braids. Her gaze locked onto Cale immediately, sharp and assessing. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice carrying both authority and suspicion. "This is Cale," Lyra said quickly, stepping between him and the growing crowd. "He claims to be from before the Exodus. He says he has information about what happened to our people." Mira's expression darkened. "And you brought him here, to our home." "He knows things," Lyra insisted, though even she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "Things we need to know." Cale stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I've spent years uncovering the truth about what humanity did to your people, to all of us. I came here because I believe we can use that knowledge to fight back." A murmur spread through the chamber, voices rising in a mix of anger and disbelief. One man stood abruptly, his face flushed with fury. "You think we haven't heard enough lies from humans?" he shouted. "They destroyed our world once. Why should we trust you now?" Cale flinched but held his ground. "Because I'm not just human," he replied steadily. "I'm one of you, or at least I used to be. Before they took me, before they changed me." The room fell silent. Even Lyra found herself staring at him, startled by the raw honesty in his words. Mira studied him for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable. Finally, she gestured for him to sit near the fire. "Tell us everything," she commanded. "But know this, if you lie, there will be consequences." Cale nodded, taking a seat on the cold stone floor. As the flames danced in the firelight, he began to speak, his voice low and steady. He told them of the experiments conducted on abducted individuals, of genetic modifications meant to create obedient laborers and soldiers. He described the sterile labs, the endless tests, and the cruel indifference of those who called themselves scientists. Each word painted a picture darker than any nightmare Lyra had ever imagined. When he finished, the room was eerily quiet. Some looked away, unable to meet his eyes, while others clenched their fists in silent rage. Mira leaned forward, her expression grim. "If what you say is true," she said slowly, "then we must act. But first, we need proof." "There's an archive," Cale explained, "in the ruins of our old capital city. It contains records of everything. The experiments, the abductions, the plans. If we can retrieve it, we'll have all the evidence we need." Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. The capital city was forbidden territory, a place shrouded in myths of cursed machines and deadly traps. Yet, as she glanced around the chamber, she saw determination hardening in the faces of her people. For the first time in years, they had hope and a reason to fight. "Then we go," Lyra said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. "We'll find the truth, and make sure no one forgets." As the crowd dispersed, Lyra caught Cale's gaze. There was gratitude in his eyes, but also fear. Whatever awaited them in the ruins, it wouldn't be easy. Still, she knew one thing for certain. They couldn't turn back now. The journey to the ruins of the ancient capital began at dawn, when the twin suns painted the horizon in hues of orange and violet. Lyra and Cale moved quickly, their footsteps crunching against the dry, cracked earth as they left the sanctuary behind. The air grew colder with each passing mile, carrying the faint metallic tang of rusted machinery and decay. Ahead loomed the jagged silhouette of the shattered spire, a skeletal remnant of what was once the heart of their civilization. As they walked, Cale broke the silence. "Do you remember anything about this place?" he asked, his tone cautious, almost hesitant. Lyra shook her head, her gaze fixed on the distant ruins. "Only stories," she admitted. Legends say it was the center of our knowledge, the place where we kept records of everything we knew. But after the Exodus, no one dared return. Cale nodded thoughtfully. It makes sense they'd hide the archive here. If anyone ever wanted to rebuild, this would be the first place they'd look. But it's also dangerous, Lyra added sharply, glancing at him. The elders warned us about traps, automated defenses left over from the war. Machines that don't care who they kill. Cale smiled grimly. I've dealt with human tech before. I can help us get through, if you trust me enough to let me try. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Trust was a fragile thing, especially now. She had spent years surviving on instinct and self-reliance, and letting someone else take the lead felt unnatural. Yet, deep down, she knew Cale had skills she lacked. His knowledge of human systems might be their only chance of reaching the archive safely. By midday, they reached the outskirts of the city. Towering structures leaned precariously, their surfaces scarred by battles long past. Broken drones lay scattered across the ground like discarded toys, their circuits exposed and lifeless. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of shifting metal overhead. This way, Cale said, pointing toward the base of the spire. As they approached, a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each step. Suddenly, panels on the ground slid open, revealing rows of dormant turrets. Red lights blinked to life, scanning the area. Stay still, Cale whispered, raising his hand slowly. He pulled a small device from his belt, a sleek gadget unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. With practiced movements, he interfaced it with one of the turrets, bypassing its security protocols. The hum faded, and the machines powered down. Impressed despite herself, Lyra raised an eyebrow. Where did you learn to do that? Cale shrugged, pocketing the device. Survival has its lessons. They pressed onward, navigating narrow alleys littered with debris. At one point, they encountered a massive gate sealed shut by layers of reinforced alloy. While Cale worked on unlocking it, Lyra kept watch, her plasma blade ready. Her eyes darted around, scanning for movement. The longer they stayed, the more uneasy she felt. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting. When the gate finally creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond, Cale turned to her. We're close, he said quietly, but things are going to get harder from here. Lyra nodded, gripping her blade tighter. Let's keep moving. Inside, the walls were lined with glowing symbols that pulsed faintly, casting eerie shadows on the floor. Every step echoed loudly, making them feel exposed. They soon came upon a chamber filled with holographic displays frozen in time. Images of scientists and soldiers flickered faintly, their faces cold and detached. In the center stood a pedestal holding what looked like a crystalline orb, the archive. There it is, Cale breathed, awe evident in his voice. Before they could move closer, the ground trembled beneath their feet. Panels on the ceiling shifted, revealing robotic sentinels descending silently. Their red optics locked onto Lyra and Cale. Looks like we've overstayed our welcome, Lyra muttered, raising her blade. Cale grinned nervously. Guess it's showtime. As the machines advanced, Lyra realized this mission wouldn't just test their strength, it would test their bond. Together, they fought side by side, blending Cale's technical expertise with Lyra's raw determination. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope, not just for survival, but for justice. The chamber erupted into chaos as the robotic sentinels descended, their mechanical limbs whirring with deadly precision. Lyra reacted instinctively, lunging forward with her plasma blade. The weapon hummed to life, slicing through one of the machines with a burst of sparks. Cale, meanwhile, scrambled for cover behind a fallen pillar, pulling out his gadget-laden tool belt. His fingers moved swiftly over a small device, attempting to hack into the Sentinel's systems. Can't you just shut them down? Lyra shouted, dodging a volley of energy blasts that scorched the ground where she had stood moments before. I'm trying. Cale snapped back, sweat beading on his forehead. "These things are older than I thought. They don't follow standard protocols." Lyra gritted her teeth and swung her blade again, cleaving another sentinel in half. But for every machine they destroyed, two more seemed to emerge from hidden alcoves in the walls. The room felt like it was closing in around them, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt metal and ozone. As she fought, something strange began to happen. A faint buzzing filled her ears, growing louder with each passing second. At first, she dismissed it as fatigue or adrenaline, but then the voices came, whispery, fragmented, and hauntingly familiar. They spoke in her native tongue, words overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Remember. Do not forget. Find us." Startled, Lyra stumbled backward, nearly dropping her blade. One of the sentinels seized the opportunity, its claw-like arm swiping at her. She barely managed to dodge, the blow grazing her shoulder and sending a sharp pang of pain through her body. "Lyra," Cale yelled, tossing her a small explosive charge he'd rigged together. She caught it mid-air and hurled it toward a cluster of advancing machines. The explosion lit up the chamber, momentarily halting the assault. "What's wrong?" Cale demanded, noticing her dazed expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "The voices," she whispered, clutching her head. "I can hear them, coming from everywhere." Cale froze, his eyes widening. "The archive. It must be activating some kind of neural interface. Our people designed these systems to communicate directly with users. You're connected to it." "Connected? What does that even mean?" Lyra shot back, frustration bubbling over. She didn't have time for cryptic explanations while killer robots were closing in. "It means the archive recognizes you," Cale explained hurriedly. "It's trying to show you something. Memories, maybe, or data stored within. Focus on it. Use it." Lyra hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. The voices grew clearer now, weaving together fragments of images in her mind. Sprawling cities bathed in sunlight, laughter echoing through bustling markets, faces she hadn't seen since childhood. And then darker visions, labs filled with terrified captives, cold hands prying open wounds, screams silenced by sterile walls. She gasped, tears streaming down her face as realization hit her like a tidal wave. These weren't just memories. They were truths buried deep beneath layers of propaganda and lies. Humanity hadn't come to conquer. They had come to exploit. Her people hadn't simply vanished. They had been erased, piece by piece, until nothing remained but ruins and whispers. Through the haze of revelation, Lyra noticed the pedestal holding the crystalline orb glowing brighter. The archive wasn't just a record. It was alive, pulsating with the collective consciousness of her ancestors. It wanted her to remember, to fight. With newfound resolve, she stepped toward the pedestal, ignoring the chaos around her. The sentinels paused, their red optics flickering uncertainly. Even Cale stopped what he was doing, watching in stunned silence. Reaching out, Lyra placed her hand on the orb. Instantly, a surge of energy coursed through her veins, filling her with warmth and clarity. The whispers became a single voice, soft yet commanding. "You are our hope." And then everything went still. When Lyra opened her eyes, the sentinels lay deactivated, their lights extinguished. The chamber was silent except for the faint hum of the archive. Cale approached cautiously, his expression a mix of awe and concern. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "I remembered," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Now we make sure no one forgets." The silence in the chamber was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the crystalline orb still glowing softly beneath Lyra's hand. Cale stood a few paces away, his eyes darting between her and the deactivated sentinels. He seemed torn, unsure whether to celebrate their survival or question what had just happened. "What did you mean back there?" he asked finally, his voice low but laced with urgency. "When you said, 'Now we make sure no one forgets.'" Lyra turned to face him, her expression hardening as fragments of the archive's revelations continued to swirl in her mind. She could still feel the weight of her ancestors' voices urging her to act. "I meant exactly that," she replied firmly. "This archive isn't just a relic, it's proof. Proof of what they did to us, to our people. And it's time the galaxy knows the truth." Kale nodded slowly, though his brow furrowed with unease. "I agree we need to expose this," he said carefully. "But do you realize what that means? Once we take this data public, there's no going back. Humanity won't let this slide. They'll come after us with everything they've got." "I know," Lyra shot back, her tone sharp. "And I'm ready for that. Are you?" Her question hung in the air like a challenge. Kale hesitated, glancing at the orb before meeting her gaze. For a moment, all Lyra saw was guilt etched into his features. The same guilt she'd noticed when he first revealed himself to her. It made her chest tighten with anger and doubt. "You left us," she said suddenly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You disappeared during the Exodus. You didn't fight alongside us. You ran. How am I supposed to trust you now?" Kale flinched as if struck, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her accusation. "You think I'd wanted to leave," he countered, his voice rising slightly. "I was taken, Lyra. Taken and forced into their labs. They experimented on me, changed me, made me something I never asked to be. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Lyra clenched her fists, fighting back tears. "No, I don't. But maybe if you'd stayed, if you'd fought instead of running, I wouldn't have spent my entire life wondering why you abandoned me." The words cut through the chamber like a blade, leaving both of them breathless. Kale looked away, his jaw tight, as if struggling to find a response. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, tinged with regret. "I didn't abandon you because I wanted to. I left because I thought I could stop them. From the inside. I sabotaged their experiments whenever I could, destroyed records, delayed shipments." He paused, swallowing hard. But none of it was enough. Not without help. Lyra stared at him, her anger warring with the flicker of understanding creeping into her heart. She wanted to believe him, to forgive him. But years of pain and loss weren't so easily erased. "Even if that's true," she said finally, her voice softer but still guarded, "it doesn't change the fact that you're not the same person anymore. You're part human now. How can I know where your loyalties lie?" Kale took a step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of sincerity. "My loyalty has always been to our people, to you," he insisted. "Whatever they did to me, whatever they tried to turn me into, I never stopped remembering who I was, who we were." For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the archive filled the void between them, a reminder of the stakes they faced. Finally, Lyra exhaled sharply, lowering her guard just enough to nod. "Fine," she said. "We'll work together, for now. But if you betray me again—" "I won't," Kale interrupted, his voice firm. "I swear it." With that uneasy truce settled, they refocused on the task at hand. Kale retrieved the crystalline orb from its pedestal, cradling it carefully in his hands. As he examined it, the symbols etched into its surface began to shift and glow, responding to his touch. "It's encrypted," he muttered, frowning. "We'll need a secure location to decrypt it fully. Somewhere safe." Lyra glanced around the chamber, her instincts screaming that staying here too long was dangerous. "Then let's get out of here," she said, gripping her plasma blade tightly, "before those machines decide to wake up." As they prepared to leave, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over, and that trusting Kale might be the hardest choice she'd ever have to make. The trek back to Kale's ship was fraught with tension, the weight of their unresolved arguments hanging heavy in the air. Lyra walked ahead, her plasma blade slung across her back, and her thoughts tangled like thorny vines. Every step felt heavier than the last, not because of physical exhaustion, but because of the storm brewing inside her. She wanted to trust Kale, truly she did, But how could she reconcile the boy he once was with the man standing beside her now? A man who carried pieces of humanity within him, both literally and figuratively. Cale, for his part, kept a respectful distance, sensing her need for space. Yet every so often, he would glance at her, his expression unreadable beneath the dim light of the twin moons. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he spoke. "Lyra," he began hesitantly, "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But if we're going to do this, to expose the truth, we need to work as a team. No more doubts." Lyra stopped walking and turned to face him, her golden eyes blazing with intensity. "You think I don't want that?" she shot back. "Of course I do. But teamwork requires trust, Cale. And trust isn't something you can just demand." Her words struck a nerve, and Cale visibly recoiled, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her accusation. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but instead, he nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I can't force you to trust me. All I can do is prove myself, again and again, until you see that I'm still the same person I used to be." Lyra studied him carefully, searching for signs of deception or hesitation. But all she saw was sincerity etched into every line of his face. It wasn't enough to erase years of pain, but it was a start. They pressed on, reaching the half-buried ship just as the first rays of dawn painted the horizon in pale hues of pink and gold. Cale quickly set about powering up the vessel while Lyra kept watch, her senses sharp for any sign of danger. The crystalline orb sat securely in its containment unit, pulsing faintly as though alive with anticipation. Once on board, Cale brought up the orb's interface on the ship's main console. Symbols flickered across the screen, shifting rapidly as the decryption process began. "This will take time," he explained, rubbing his temples. "The encryption is complex. It'll take hours, maybe even days, to fully unlock." Lyra leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "We don't have days," she said flatly. "If we stay here too long, they'll find us." "They?" Cale asked, raising an eyebrow. "The humans," she clarified, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You said yourself, they won't let this slide. They'll come looking for us." Cale sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Then we keep moving," he decided. "We'll head for the asteroid belt near Sector 9. It's remote enough to buy us some time." As the ship lifted off, Lyra stared out the viewport, watching the ruins of their ancient capital shrink into the distance. Her mind raced with questions about what lay ahead, and whether she was truly ready to face it. Hours passed in relative silence, interrupted only by the occasional beep of the decryption system. Lyra eventually drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by fragmented visions of her ancestors' voices whispering warnings she couldn't quite decipher. When she woke, Cale was seated nearby, staring intently at the console. His face lit up when he noticed her stirring. "Good news," he said, gesturing toward the screen. "The decryption is almost complete." Lyra approached cautiously, peering over his shoulder. On the display, lines of text scrolled rapidly, revealing classified files detailing experiments, abductions, and plans for colonization. One file caught her attention, a video log showing a younger version of herself alongside Cale, both strapped to operating tables. Her breath hitched as memories flooded back, raw and painful. "This is it," Cale murmured, his voice trembling. "Everything they try to hide." Lyra clenched her fists, anger and resolve burning brightly within her. "Then let's make sure the whole galaxy sees it." But before they could celebrate, the ship's alarms blared to life. A red warning flashed on the screen. "Incoming vessels detected." Cale cursed under his breath, frantically scanning the radar. "Human ships," he confirmed grimly. "They found us." Lyra grabbed her blade, determination hardening her features. "Guess we're not done fighting yet." The ship shuddered violently as the human vessels closed in, their sleek forms cutting through space like predators stalking prey. Lyra gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white, while Kel worked feverishly to reroute power to the engines. "We can't outrun them," he muttered, his voice tight with urgency. "They're faster and armed." "Then we fight," Lyra replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. She strapped on her plasma blade, its familiar hum grounding her amidst the chaos. "We've come too far to let them take this from us." Kel hesitated, glancing at the partially decrypted archive glowing faintly on the console. "If they board us and get their hands on that data," his voice trailed off. But the implication was clear. "They won't," Lyra said firmly. "Not if we have anything to say about it." The first volley of laser fire rocked the ship, sending sparks flying from the control panel. Alarms blared deafeningly, and the lights flickered ominously. Kel managed to stabilize the ship just long enough to plot a desperate course toward the asteroid belt, a maze of jagged rocks and debris that might buy them some time. As they hurtled into the belt, the human ships followed relentlessly, weaving between asteroids with terrifying precision. Lyra braced herself against the wall as explosions lit up the viewport, chunks of rock disintegrating under enemy fire. "Hold on," Kel shouted, yanking the controls hard to avoid a collision. The ship groaned under the strain, its hull scraping dangerously close to an asteroid's jagged surface. "We need more than luck," Lyra growled, her mind racing. Then she spotted something, a cluster of unstable asteroids ahead. "There, aim for those rocks." Kel didn't question her. With a sharp turn, he guided the ship toward the cluster, narrowly avoiding another barrage of lasers. As they passed through, Lyra activated the ship's rear cannons, firing blindly into the field behind them. The resulting chain reaction was spectacular. Asteroids shattered into smaller fragments, creating a deadly storm that forced the pursuing ships to retreat or risk being torn apart. For a moment, there was silence aboard the ship, broken only by the hum of the engines and the soft glow of the archive. Lyra slumped into a seat, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Did we lose them?" she asked breathlessly. "For now," Kel replied, though his expression remained grim. "But they'll regroup. We need to finish decrypting the data and broadcast it before they find us again." Working together, they focused all their efforts on the final stages of the decryption process. When the last file unlocked, the screen filled with damning evidence, videos, documents, and logs detailing humanity's atrocities. It was everything they had hoped for, and more. "This changes everything," Kel whispered, his voice heavy with awe. "With this, we can expose the truth to the entire galaxy." Lyra nodded, her resolve unwavering. Using what little time they had, they transmitted the data across every available frequency, embedding it in news feeds, communication networks, and public archives. By the time the transmission finished, their ship's systems were failing, battered by both combat and the asteroid field. "We did it," Lyra said softly, leaning back in her seat. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for her people. Their story would no longer be forgotten. Kel reached over, placing a tentative hand on hers. "We did," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Outside the viewport, the stars twinkled brightly, indifferent yet eternal. The shadows of the past still lingered, but for the first time, they didn't feel so heavy. Together, Lyra and Kel had eclipsed eternity, not by erasing the pain, but by ensuring it would never fade into silence again.